Okay. Can you hear me? No. מצוין. Okay. So, hi everyone. What I'm going to talk about today is more of a methodological point, but I think maybe a substantial one, about the way we study conscious and unconscious processes. And some of the things I will say might be a bit provocative, but I hope you will get them, you will accept them with a sense of acceptance. And I'm happy to debate over them, and I'll try to leave as much time as I can for questions. But in a way, it kind of represents, I wouldn't say an existential crisis that I've been experiencing, but some kind of a crisis as a researcher trying to understand consciousness and asking what types of tools do we have in order to answer that question. So I'll first introduce the problem, and then I'll try to describe three ways by which we try to address it in our lab, by changing the stimuli we use, changing the methods we use, and also changing the questions that we ask. So I'm going to start with the well-known metaphor of the iceberg, suggested by Leibniz and Freud and others, whereby conscious processes are only the tip of the iceberg, the thing that we experience, but underneath the surface of the water, there are many unconscious processes to which we are unaware, and they influence our behavior. And one very interesting question that I've been trying to pursue is what is the difference between these two types of processes? Neurally wise, but also functionally wise. And I'm not talking about functionalism versus identity theory here, but in terms of psychological functions or cognitive functions. Throughout the years, there have been many suggestions that try to dichotomize the difference between these two types of processes, claiming that conscious processes are integrative, while unconscious processes are encapsulated. Conscious processes allow flexibility, while unconscious processes are habitual, the types of things that we do without flexibility. And the conscious processes are controlled, while unconscious processes are automatic. These are just a few examples, but there have been other suggestions as well. And it seems as if the field in the last 2 decades or so has been racing towards showing that these dichotomies are false. So different people, myself included, have tried to say, well, no, consciousness might not, unconscious processes might also allow some form of control. Unconscious processes might also allow some form of flexibility. And unconscious processes might allow some integration. I once thought it was high-level integration. Today I'm more modest in that respect and think that maybe this is not the case. But in any case, all these papers and all these works have made people question these dichotomies and ask maybe unconscious processes can do everything that conscious processes can do. And I think a very interesting and thought-provoking suggestion for that approach was Ran Hassin's Yes It Can paper, claiming that indeed everything that we do consciously could also be achieved unconsciously to some extent. But then I said, let's stop for a minute and try to think of how we tackle this problem. So what are the tools that we have in order to ask this question? So typically what we do is we show a subject some stimulus consciously, and we record either the neural activity or the behavioral response to that stimulus. And we know more or less what to expect when subjects process that kind of stimulus. And then we render that stimulus invisible using different techniques. And we ask, do we still see the same or some brain response that would serve as evidence for that person processing that stimulus, or some behavioral response that would do the same? And in order to render the stimulus invisible, we have different techniques in our toolbox. And I won't go into that. There are many nice reviews, some of them written by people who are sitting here, about the different ways we have as experimentalists in order to render stimuli invisible. So we can embed a stimulus in noise. We could mask it, so show it very briefly between meaningless stimuli to prevent the conscious perception of it. We could crowd it, present it in the periphery, crowded by masks or flankers. We could use continuous flash suppression, where one eye is kind of bombarded with colorful stimuli that are flashed, usually at 10 hertz, and that would render the other stimulus presented to the other eye invisible. It's a variant of binocular rivalry. And we could also use attentional manipulations, like the famous gorilla experiment, which would make subjects not see the gorilla. And we've been using these techniques for a lot of time. To this day, in my lab, we have many experiments using these types of theories. Techniques. I won't go into details, just to give you a taste and also maybe to invoke discussions later on over lunch or during reception about some of these things that we do. So Amir Tal and Oren Beirav have tried to use CFS in order to show that there might be contextual learning without awareness, and we found some evidence for that. We are now trying to replicate that, and if that would indeed be replicated, I think it would be a very interesting finding that subjects can learn a context even though they are unaware of it. Itai Linzen and Alisa Truman and Inbal Gurarieh are trying to continuously probe this question of context-object integration without awareness. Today, we have more and more evidence that there shouldn't be or there isn't such type of integration without awareness. We also now show it with EEG. And Dan Biderman and Yarden Shir have used masking in order to mask contextual inducers like A and B that are or 12 and 14, while the ambiguous stimulus, the famous B13 stimulus, is visible. And what we show is that even when A and C or 12 and 14 are invisible, subjects are still affected by them when they say whether this stimulus is a B or a 13. Now, just to show you, this is the conscious effect. This is the replicable but unconscious effect. And you can see the differences between the magnitude of the effects when this is visible versus invisible. So yes, it seems like maybe subjects can integrate contextual cues and be influenced by them when they classify or perceive an ambiguous stimulus, but the extent of the effect is way smaller. And this is one of the things that I keep working on these effects. I keep getting these very small effects, and some of them do not replicate. It's kind of like a minefield, experimental minefield. So this is one fundamental problem in our field, that we have very, very weak signals because we impoverish the stimuli that we are using so much. Another problem that we should take into account is that even after several decades of this type of research, we still don't have a strong agreement about how to operationally define what is conscious and what is unconscious. Are subjective measures enough? Do we need to add objective measures? And even if we do, what happens when we exclude subjects, like the criticism made by Shanks recently? So we keep kind of stumbling upon methodological limitations or questions that render our attempts to directly probe conscious and unconscious processes a bit more problematic. Even more important, I think, is the meaning of these results. So we showed that you can integrate a context without awareness. But what is the fundamental meaning of this finding? Or that some other people claim that we can read or do math or process emotion and so on and so forth. Here I like to quote a metaphor that was given by Hakwan Lau, and I think Christoph Koch also suggested that. Let's say that we are asking what is the function of legs. And in order to ask that, we take a subject. Let's assume that we could do that ethically. We cut off that subject's legs, and we show that that subject can still move in space. And then we would say, well, the function of legs is not to move in space. And for us, this seems flawed, but this is exactly what we do with consciousness. So we take a subject, we cut off her awareness using these techniques, and then we show that she can read or she can do whatever, and we say, well, we don't need consciousness for that. I'm not sure that that logic holds. It might be that in everyday life, this is exactly what we do. We use consciousness to read, think, compute, whatever. But in some specific lab setting, we created a situation whereby subjects will be able to read without awareness. I'm not sure that it says something about the computer is now angry because I'm making all this. Okay, let's see if it comes back to life. Exactly. And I think, and maybe the most critical point, and the one that people here might not really like, is that I'm not sure that our tools have a strong external validity. So when I inspect the difference between the theoretical construct that we want to study, which is conscious versus unconscious processes as they unfold in everyday lives, and the way we probe it in the lab, to me it seems as if there is a big difference between the two that might even transcend what we always have. So always in psychology, we have to operationalize the theoretical constructs that we work with, right? So we want to study memory, we give lists of words. We want to study conformism, we create a situation when everyone says one thing and the subject is then probed to say either the same thing or another thing. But here, I think the operationalization and the ways we found to study consciousness are very, very far from conscious and unconscious processes in everyday lives. So in everyday lives, we never, almost never, see a stimulus for 17 milliseconds embedded in noise. We surely never we are never presented with two different lines of stimulation to the two different eyes. So it might be that we were able in the lab, and it's an amazing, I wish I was smart enough to invent such a technique. So these are all extremely elegant, well-controlled methodologies that allow us to indeed experimentally tease apart conscious and unconscious processes. But I think the cost of that is that it drew us somewhat afar or far away from what happens in real life. And I would claim that in real life, it's actually the gorilla experiment that is most similar to what happens when we either consciously or unconsciously perceive a stimulus. So actually, attentional manipulations might be better off here. So in a way, if we go back to the iceberg metaphor, this is a picture. It's not a good picture, but it's the only one I found for a synthetic polymer that is used in order to create artificial ice skating arenas. So, and this is what people kind of import in order to have some experience of ice in iceless countries. The idea is that it seems to me as if we have all been focusing on this artificial ice, while what we really want to study is the actual iceberg. And we've been making claims about conscious and unconscious processes in real life, while in fact we have these, again, highly elegant, beautiful psychophysical manipulations that create some sort of conscious and unconscious processing in the lab that I'm not sure that it transcends outside the lab. And a friend of mine called me, I think it was 2 years ago already. I keep using that example because I like it. She called me and she was furious after this parent-teacher meeting. And she said, well, the teacher says that my son cannot focus in class and he might have ADHD or something like that. And I told her it doesn't make sense because at home in front of the computer, he focuses for 3 hours playing the video games. And what I told her was, well, first of all, I empathized with the situation. But later on I said, well, maybe because there is something different that happens to us when we sit in front of a computer as opposed to what happens to us in the outside environment. And it also might be the case here. So it might be the case that with CFS we can do amazing things, or with masking, but maybe that doesn't transcend or translate, that's the word I was looking for, to what happens in everyday life. So I will try to present 3 ways by which we try to attack this problem. So I've been kind of picking the brains of my students and forcing them to think of ways to study consciousness differently. So one of them, Uri Koriski, said, well, why don't we try, instead of masking things on the computer, why don't we try to mask things in the environment, real life things? So now change the stimuli that we are studying. And in a collaboration with the Shiva Hospital and 2 other students, Dan Biderman started this, and now Ronnie Hirschhorn is doing it, try to change the methods. Maybe we can, also Itai Yaron, who is sitting here, is working on this project. Maybe we could try to simulate real life situations that are more similar to the gorilla experiment, where we could probe unconscious processes that are more reminiscent of what happens in everyday life. And the last thing I will briefly describe is how we could also maybe change the questions. So let's start with changing the stimuli. What Uri suggested was, let's try to focus on real life objects. And we know already from previous literature that real life objects are different from 2D representations of these objects. So they are learned earlier, they are remembered better, they grab your attention, and they even evoke different neural activations. So what Uri said was, let's try to take the CFS, an artificial methodology, but use augmented reality so we could now suppress real-life objects. So what happens here is that she's using, Felice is wearing augmented reality goggles. One eye will be presented with CFS, the other, this one I think, the other would be completely transparent, so she could see the actual objects that are presented in front of her. And I'm not sure you can hear the sound. You cannot. Well, I'll tell you what's going on. So she is now, this is what she sees on the goggles. This is just a small display that we built for this small demonstration. And what would happen next, a bit unfortunate we cannot hear it, but never mind, he's now explaining to her what is about to happen. And now the display starts. First we kind of block out her vision by making the goggles white, and then we present CFS on one goggle, and the other is now becomes transparent, and there is a small rubber ducky, and she won't see the duck, and then Uri puts his hand, moves it, he even puts his face, and she still doesn't see anything. And when he just asks her to close one eye, the eye where the CFS display is being projected, she's laughing, you cannot hear it, now she sees his face. So now we are able to suppress real-life objects. What the subject sees is we have this device, a more serious device than the one that we showed you before. We have the curtain, it comes up, and then the CFS display starts, and at some point, the stimulus will emerge into awareness. So the first thing Uri did was to try and validate this methodology. So our lab became into some kind of art workshop thing. He collected objects, real-life objects. He then photographed with a professional photographer these objects in the device. He then went to a graphic designer to create 2D replicas of the 3D stimulus. So this is the actual Hungarian cube, Rubik cube, and these are 2D replications of that cube. And the first thing we wanted to see is whether we can actually suppress these objects. And we can. So when we present the CFS stimulation for 5 seconds, in about 75% of the trials, 80% subjects just don't see the suppressed stimuli. And for these trials, they are a chance in saying whether they were presented to the right or to the left. And there was an interesting observation here, Ronnie Hirschhorn also helped, is that it seemed as if real objects were perceived in more trials than the 2D representations. And then we kind of set off into a different exploration to ask, well, maybe 3D objects emerge into awareness faster than 2D representations. So what Uri did was to present now the CFS for 20 seconds and just measure the time it takes to this stimuli to emerge into awareness. And first of all, we saw that even with this method, with the augmented reality, we get relatively long suppression duration, so about 6-7 seconds. And again, we have this difference. The real objects emerge into awareness about a second earlier than the 2D images that are just, we glue them on these cardboard, so they are presented there on the device. So then what we asked was, what drives this effect? Is this some low-level thing that makes the 3D objects emerge into awareness faster? Or maybe it's related to, for example, affordances. So the motor plans that each object affords to us when we see it as part of its representation. So in order to test that question, what Uri did was actually to create 3D models of all these objects. So, and then he 3D printed them. So for each actual object, we had a printed version. And why did we need that? In order to create scrambled versions of these objects. So now we have a 2x2 design where we have real objects and scrambled objects that are either 3D or 2D printed. All of them are printed, so now we don't have any difference in reflectivity. So one of the reasons we said maybe this faster emergence into awareness is induced by some, flashy part of the real objects that do not happen to be the case for the 2D objects. So this will, if the difference is only because of reflectivity, there should be no difference between 3D and 2D images. Another option is it's just a matter of depth. So even though subjects are only seeing it using one eye, it could be that using perspective cues, they still infer the depth somehow. So it could be just a matter of 2D versus 3D. So if this would be the case, we would expect the two types of 3D stimuli to emerge into awareness faster than the 2D images, right? And the most interesting, I think, option for us was that it might be related to affordances or the meaning of the stimuli. And if this is the case, we should only find the effect for intact stimuli. So only real-life 3D objects that are meaningful would emerge into awareness faster. And Uri conducted 2 experiments, and this is what he found. Now, Uri is very complicated, so he also prepares complicated figures. I will try to, but that only shows to his complexity of thinking. So I will try to show you what we see here. So these are 2 experiments, 20 subjects, 50 subjects. Let's focus on, because we know how to interpret bar plots, right? So there is there is a difference between the 2D and the 3D, with the 3D emerging faster for intact objects, but not for scrambled objects. What you see here in the big plot, so the x-axis is the difference between 3D and 2D for intact objects, and the y-axis is the difference between 3D and 2D for scrambled objects, meaning that, and these are the means, these are individual subjects, these are the means. Everything that, basically every dot with respect to the x-axis that is left to the 0 point means that the 3D objects emerge faster than the 2D objects. Everything that is on the middle, this actually was supposed to be here. So everything that is on the 0 line for the y-axis is 0 difference between the scrambled and the between the 3D and the 2D stimuli for the scrambled condition. And what you can see is that there is a divergence from the 0 line for the x-axis, but there isn't one for the y-axis. So this is basically the same figure, but shown for individual data. In any case, what this implies is that indeed 3D objects emerge into awareness faster than 2D objects, only for intact stimuli. Why is that interesting? First of all, because it might tell us something about the way we unconsciously process affordances, but also because what Uri can now do is use this newly developed method in order to ask questions about, first of all, more salient stimuli. So we think that we might be able to overcome some of the issues with the weak stimulation, because now I can present to study emotion. I should not suffice with just presenting a face on a screen that shows anger. I could actually show an angry person to that person, and the person would not see it, the subject. And more importantly, we could test theories like the two visual streams. So if indeed we have vision for action and vision for perception, maybe subjects like patient DF would be able to take a card and insert it into a slot, although they don't even see the slot. And if we are able to show something like that, or even something that seems to go in that direction, that would be a very strong evidence for the separation between vision for action and vision for perception. So the idea is that this kind of technique allows us to ask questions that before we could not ask. For example, what is the role of conscious perception in action, in interacting with your environment, and not only with seeing stimuli on screen? So this is one approach. The second approach is to use the methods and to rely more on attentional manipulations when we study consciousness. And I know some of us in the room probably would not like this approach. But again, I would claim, and I'm happy to defend that claim, that it's more similar to conscious and unconscious processes in everyday life. And we think that that would also help us attack the weakness of the signals. So the idea was, what we try to do is to try to mimic the gorilla experiment. But the problem with the gorilla experiment is that you do it once and then you always see the gorilla. So the question is, how can we create a situation where subjects keep missing the gorilla although they are asked? We have to ask them to know whether they saw it or not. So what Dan Biderman started to do, and now Ronnie Hirschhorn is doing in collaboration with Meir Plotnik at the Sheba Hospital, is to use, they have this 3D dome where they can project an environment on a 360 degrees screen, and it interacts with the subject. So it's a form of virtual reality, but actually projected on a screen and not using the goggles. And basically what we did there, and this is very preliminary, we are trying to improve it all the time, so it takes time. We have subjects walking, and there are 3 bees. You will see it in a second when the video starts. So there are 3 bees that are moving on the screen all the time. And the subject's task is to focus on one of the bees that we signal out. So she is kind of going over them, and she, at the end of the trial, she should say which of the 3 bees was the one that we marked at the beginning. And in the background, we are presenting images that are either neutral or very emotionally aversive. At the end of the trial, she's walking down the street. At the end of the trial, we ask her how much of the, if she saw any ad that is not scrambled, and if so, to make a discrimination between 4 such ads. So just to show you how this goes. Okay, so she's walking. We mark one of the bees, and now the bees start moving. And while she's tracking them with her eyes, we project on the environment either a scrambled billboard, a scrambled image, or an intact image. You can see that the images are big, they are in the periphery, of course, and we make sure that the bees would actually fly over these billboards to make sure that the eyes actually get to that point in space. And we do that repeatedly. And what we get at the end, we get about 75% of trials where she misses. She says, I didn't see anything, any such image, although it's big and presented here. And when we ask her to say which one of 4 images it was, she's a chance in these trials where she says that she didn't see anything. So this is very preliminary still, but we think that it simulates everyday life much better than what we typically do in the lab, because this is basically what happens. I walk down the street, the environment is rich, I miss some of the things, I see others, and so now we can ask, can we indeed read without awareness? When I'm going down the street and there are billboards on the side and there are words written there, if I don't see them consciously, I don't experience them consciously, do I still process that information? I am not sure that what we find in masking and CFS would actually extend into these types of situations. Maybe it will. But I think it's important to ask the question and not just assume that this happens. It might evoke stronger effects because the stimuli are way more salient. And the idea is to apply in-lab measures of objective and subjective tests of awareness on an out-of-lab study. But we use attention. So for some, this is a problem because they say, well, you're actually studying attended versus unattended. My answer would be yes, but in most cases, I think, in real life, this is the gate to conscious and unconscious. So I'm happy to pay that price. In the few minutes I have left, I will just describe one other way that we can make our studies more ecological is to change the questions that we ask. And this actually relates to the free will debate, not to perceptual awareness per se. It's a work in collaboration with Uri Maoz, done with, in Christoph Koch's lab with the help of Ralph Adolphs and Gidon Yaffe, who is a philosopher from Yale. And this basically follows on the famous Libet experiment, where, as you know, subjects were asked to move their hands. He recorded brain activity and found the readiness potential to precede the conscious intention to move by about 500 milliseconds. This was later replicated, as you know. Going back to the iceberg versus artificial ice metaphor, people are making claims about free will based on these types of experiments. But free will in real life and actually also in philosophy, when applied to moral philosophy and to ethics, is about actual decisions that have consequences. It's not about sitting in the lab and just moving your hand whenever you feel the conscious urge to move. So the question is, could we extend our findings from this artificial paradigm? And it's so artificial that I can tell you from running it that when I tell subjects, just move your hand whenever you feel the conscious urge to move, they say, what? I don't know what you're talking about. I never feel a conscious urge to move my finger. Nonetheless, and then we ask them to say when that conscious urge happened. In real life, we don't first feel the conscious urge to move and then move. We typically just move. So this was based on philosophical differentiation between picking, which are decisions that are unreasoned and non-consequential, like going to the supermarket and selecting one milk bottle out of a row where all of them are identical, and choosing that is reasoned and consequential. So now I'm not sure which type of milk bottle I want, which brand, how many fat percentiles, and so on. So here we have reasons, and here we don't. And it seems as if the entire field of voluntary action has focused on meaningless, arbitrary decisions, while the conclusions we draw relate to meaningful and deliberate ones. So because I don't have much time, I'll just jump to what we did. Basically, we presented subjects with choices between two types of organizations, non-profit organizations. The choices were built based on ratings given by the subjects of each organization. So we presented each organization in isolation, and we asked how much would you like to donate money to that organization, and based on the subjects' ratings, we created a tailor-made experiment for each one of them. So we had difficult choices where, for example, you had to decide to which organization you want to donate money, and the organizations only differed in 1 point. And we also had easy decisions where the difference was 4 points or more. And there was one deliberate condition where when they actually made a decision, the chosen organization would get, if this trial would go into would be selected in a lottery, $40 in their name to that organization. And there was also a big lottery at the end where we chose one subject. So they had the potential of actually giving $1,000 to that organization. So they knew that every decision that they make might lead to an actual $1,000 donation to one of these organizations. And in the arbitrary block, they again pressed right or left, but now whatever they pressed, both organizations would get $500 if this trial would be selected. So the nice thing about this design, in my opinion, objective opinion, is that the visual input is identical in the two conditions. The motor output is also identical, but the meaning of the decision is utterly different. Here, it's a deliberate decision. Here, it's a completely arbitrary one. And what we get first behaviorally is that subjects are way slower for making the deliberate decisions, and they are slower for hard decisions versus easy ones. And there is no difference in the arbitrary condition, which of course makes sense. And also, when we look at consistency, in easy decisions that are deliberate, they're almost 100% consistent with their own preferences, which makes sense. If these are difficult decisions, they are at about 80% consistency. When this is a picking condition or arbitrary decision, they are more or less a chance. So they're not making decisions based on the values. What we get in terms of the brain is that for the arbitrary condition, and I'm showing you the individual data first because I think it's more informative, we get a nice readiness potential for most subjects. This is basically a replication of the Libet paradigm, but in a different setup. But in the choosing or the deliberate condition, we just don't get anything at all. So there is no readiness potential when subjects are making deliberate decisions. Now, it's not that I'm claiming here that deliberate decisions come from thin air. No, they come from the brain. And if we look at the right places, we would probably find processes leading to that decisions there. But it's not the readiness potential. And this actually goes well with the work, and this is statistically significant. This is already the average waveforms and the distribution. And this goes well with the work made by Aaron Sugar and Stanislas Dehaene, who's sitting here, claiming that the readiness potential might not be a genuine component indexing an actual cognitive process, but it could actually represent some artificial accumulation of noise, just random fluctuations that drive the decision. Now, these fluctuations would drive meaningless decisions, and that's why they would average when we sum that up. But they would not be meaningful for deliberate decisions, because then the noise is not what drives us to make the action. So then they would average out, because sometimes the noise would be high, sometimes it would be low. So Uri Maoz extended the model suggested by Aaron Sugar into deliberate versus arbitrary decisions, and showed that it's actually very similar to the type of data that we got. So to conclude, I would finish with my favorite quote ever. I use it all the time. Many of you already know it. By Stuart Sutherland from the International Dictionary of Psychology. The year was 1989, so it's relatively recent past, in my opinion at least. And he writes in that dictionary, the definition of consciousness is a fascinating but elusive phenomenon. It is impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved. Nothing worth reading has been written on it. Now, I think this represents the strong skepticism against the scientific study of consciousness that was the most dominant view in those days. And then the field had to kind of prove to all those skeptics that this is scientific, that we can study consciousness in the lab. And so they had to come up with all these genius paradigms in order to really control conscious versus unconscious and do it in the best and most elegant way. And indeed, we see many, many studies arguing about the best way to study consciousness. But my claim is that these all kind of might have took us too far from what we are really interested in studying, which is the conscious versus unconscious processes as they unfold in real life. So all these elegant paradigms are beautiful, and we use them, as I said. So I just presented 3 studies that we are now working on using these paradigms. But I think that in parallel, it's also time for us, the field has matured enough for us to ask ourselves, can we come up with new paradigms that are less controlled, but maybe pave the way to studying consciousness and conscious and unconscious processes in a more ecological manner. before I give time to questions, just one more slide. This is complete like ad thing. So you might have heard about this project that Lucia and Stan and others and myself have been involved in, trying to tease apart two competing theories, GNW and IIT. I won't go into details. I'll just say that Michael Pitts and myself are now looking for postdocs to come and help us work on this project and analyze the data. And because I know that there are many consciousness lovers, either students or PIs, I ask you to spread the word. If you know of very talented people who are very passionate about consciousness, we are looking for these people specifically. So contact us, and thank you to all the people that have been involved in this, preparing this talk.
Great talk, Liad. I'm joining the lab with this. So we have some time for questions. You take them.
Yeah, well, I'm obviously lazier than you are, and the 3D object that you showed did not qualitatively behave differently from 2D objects. They were different from scramble objects, just as 2D objects would be different from scramble objects. But I didn't see any convincing evidence that it is worth using them and that they behave qualitatively differently from 2D objects.
From 2D objects? So we see that they emerge into awareness faster.
Okay, so, well, just like bright things on the computer emerge faster than...
I agree. So the reason for us, so the faster emergence into awareness was for us just something that we found when we started to validate this paradigm. That was not the purpose of this paradigm. The purpose of this paradigm was to allow us to ask questions about conscious vision for action versus vision for perception, which I think is harder to do when you have only 2D representations. So now we have a paradigm that allows us to create a situation where subjects reach to grab an object that they don't see. This you cannot do. You simply cannot do with 2D, I think, with 2D stimulation.
You can, because our depth perception is 80% 2D cues. So, and it has been done before. So I'm not sure how much it's worth the effort. That's what I'm trying to clarify.
Yeah, so first of all, as you say, we love effort in our lab. But I think that what this allows you, so we already know from other fields of research that when you move to more ecological stimuli, you get different results. So we know that from interactions with on-screen actors versus people that are just in front of you. We see different brain activations. Also for objects versus images, we see different neural circuits, we see different attentional mechanisms. So it seems like there is something different in interacting with actual real things. And as specifically for the vision for action versus vision for perception, the only behavioral evidence that I'm aware of rely on visual illusions, showing that you can either grasp or not. But I think it's very different than being actually able to operate, to act on an object, which we just don't know. So the only evidence we have that people can interact with objects that they have no conscious representation of them is from lesion patients and so on. I'm not aware of any. If you know something, I'd be happy to learn about it. But to create a situation, a blindside situation, for example, where subjects could walk in a room although they don't see anything, I think it would be worth the effort if people can really do that. I just don't know. I only know that it happens for blindside patients, but I don't know if this transcends into into healthy population.
Only if you get qualitative differences, and that would what I would like to see.
Yeah, so we also like to see. We'll see where this takes us. Yeah. Yes.
So you mentioned at some point brain activity might be stronger if we stop using subliminal presentations and go to real-life presentation. If you actually find this, because I surmise that this weak signal in the brain is really tied to unconscious processing, no matter how you achieve that unconscious processing. What is your experience here?
So we are still at the stage of behaviorally testing these paradigms. So we haven't started any neural kind of recordings with this. So I'll be interested to see how this works. But even judging from studies that use attention as a manipulation, you get stronger activations for unattended stimuli that are supraliminal versus subliminal the stimuli that are rendered subliminal using psychophysical manipulation. So I would actually expect stronger signals.
So we subtract some unconscious processes out if we use subliminal stimuli, right?
Yes.
So we get rid of some unconscious.
Yeah.
That's bad for us.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true. And this is, we are always on this, trying to get to this sweet spot where we get enough signal, but it's not conscious yet, but we still get, yeah, I completely agree. Yeah. Yes.
How committed are you to the idea that the dorsal stream is the provenance of affordances?
I'm not. So I'm just making my first steps in the field of affordances and dorsal versus ventral. My main passion is consciousness, conscious versus unconscious processing. This entire affordances kind of rendezvous happened while we were trying to develop this paradigm. So I'm still kind of agnostic about it. I'm looking into that, no more than that. Yes.
As I see, so you reject the efforts to approach to the preconscious processes, the distinction that John Barge had made in 89. And you claim that it creates some kind of a preconscious phenomenon that has no external validity. And it's interesting to see why, at the beginning, why they turn to this level historically. Because as I'm familiar with the literature, so the researchers assume that, for example, if you take research about attitude, then they assume that if you approach to the real person and ask about his own attitude and try to measure it, then he won't give you any genuine answer. And this is why they did all these cognitive tricks and manipulation to reach the real attitudes that are inside us and are not conscious and so forth. So that's interesting to see according to what they made this turn and this assumption, and how what has changed that allow us nowadays to turn to a more conscious level.
So I think we should differentiate between two types of conscious and unconscious kind of dissociations. One is, I think, more on the social psychology level, where we try to differentiate between what we explicitly say and what we might implicitly think, or what implicitly drives our behavior, which I think is more related to the types of attitude research and Barge studies that you were referring to. What we are trying to see here is more about perceptual awareness. So we are trying to take a stimulus and get it to a stage where subjects won't even know that there was a stimulus there, and ask still what types of cognitive, emotional, whatever processes we can perform even when we don't know that something was even presented. And I think it's a very interesting question to ask, what is the relations between these two types of fields who are not interacting to a great extent? Is the same unconscious processes that we study, that are more perceptual and cognitive, I would say, do they relate to the more social types of unconscious processes? I'm not sure.
Because you also mentioned the perception for action,
Mm-hmm.
the perception for
Vision.
perception,
Mm-hmm.
vision just,
Yeah.
and some is more linked to behavior and some just for perception, but the assumption is that the perception of vision can also eventually lead to behavior.
Yeah, so it's a very good point. I'll be happy to discuss. We have time for... Yes.
One more question.
Yes.
You made a point about the difference between artificial things like CFS and natural things, but actually the difference is between explicit invisibility and implicit, you don't see it. So being aware of being unaware versus being unaware. So can you...
Yeah, that's a very interesting point that I haven't... so there is a lot of literature about what happens when we are forced to report whether we see or not see, and what types of engaging or confounding processes might be evoked by this type of task. as opposed to a situation where we're unaware and we don't even know, we don't introspect on being unaware. I think it's a very interesting distinction. I haven't really thought about it when trying to devise these experiments, but and because we force them to say, so we ask them. It's not a no report paradigm, but it's a very good point that is also, I think, widely discussed these days with Ned Block and others claiming that we should probably avoid from doing that as well. But we're taking it one step at a time in that respect.
Let's continue
Yes.
this over coffee.